Elvis Presley. The name itself brings a flash of images. A gyrating rebel with a sneer, a sequin king in Las Vegas. A quiet man reading spiritual books. A lonely figure locked in Graceland. Everyone thinks they know him, or at least they know an Elvis. But the truth is, the man behind the legend was far more complex. He was a puzzle of contradictions, a human being pulled in countless directions by fame, family, ambition, and inner turmoil. We often look at the big moments, the first hit single Heartbreak Hotel in 1956, the screams of millions, the army service, the movie career, the Vegas comeback in 1969, and then the sad end in 1977. These are headlines. But what about the person living through all of it? What made him tick? What scarred him? What gave him joy? Think about it. A kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, born in a two-room house, twin brother stillborn. His mother, Gladys, doted on him with a fierce love. His father, Vernon, was often absent, sometimes even in jail. This wasn't a stable, easy start. And then, almost overnight, he became the most famous person on earth. How does that change a person? What psychological weight does that kind of fame carry? We can't sit Elvis down on a couch today, but we can look at what he left behind. Thousands of interviews, countless photographs, private notes, recordings, films, and the memories of those who knew him best. Our biographers, like Peter Guralnick, have spent decades piecing together his life from these fragments, creating incredibly detailed portraits in books like Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love. Alana Nash's work, like Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, offers perspectives from his inner circle. These resources, along with historical records and contemporary accounts, allow us to construct different psychological profiles. These aren't clinical diagnoses, they are ways of understanding the forces that shaped him, the various facets of his personality that emerged and shifted over his extraordinary, often tragic, life. We can see 16 distinct psychological tendencies, needs, or struggles that defined him. They tell a story not just of a superstar, but of a very human being caught in an impossible situation. And understanding them helps us grasp the man, not just the myth. Number 16. Does the boy who lost his twin brother always feel incomplete? Elvis was born on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi. It was a humble beginning in a two-room shotgun house. But it was also a beginning shadowed by immediate loss. His mother, Gladys Presley, gave birth to twins that day. Jesse Garon Presley arrived first, stillborn. Elvis Aaron Presley followed, alive and healthy. This fact, the loss of his identical twin, isn't just a biographical detail, it's a foundational element of his psychological makeup. The psychologists and biographers have often pointed to the profound impact this early trauma had on Elvis. As Gladys herself was deeply affected, she grieved for Jesse for her entire life, and this grief naturally transferred to Elvis. He became, in a sense, the living embodiment of both her sons. The bond between them became almost unnaturally strong, fueled by this shared, unspoken sorrow. Elvis often spoke of Jesse, sometimes feeling like his twin was still with him, a presence, a part of him that was missing. This wasn't just a casual thought, it was a deeply held feeling reported by friends and family. Even in later life, when he was the king of rock and roll, the memory of Jesse Garon was very real to him. This early loss likely contributed to a profound sense of loneliness that often plagued him, even when surrounded by adoring crowds. It was a void that perhaps nothing could truly fill. Biographer Peter Guralnick explores this relationship with Gladys and the impact of Jesse's death extensively in Last Train to Memphis, painting a picture of an unusually close mother-son bond. This bond, intensified by the ghost of a lost sibling, might explain some of Elvis's lifelong need for companionship and his difficulty with solitude. The constant search for connection, the almost desperate need for people around him, could be seen as an attempt to fill that original existential emptiness. He surrounded himself with the Memphis Mafia, a group of friends and relatives, some of whom became employees. They were always there, a constant presence. This wasn't just about security or convenience, it was about never being truly alone, never facing that primal solitude he experienced from birth. This need for constant companionship and his avoidance of being alone are frequently documented in accounts from those who worked and lived with him, such as Marty Lacker and Red West, as collected in books like Elvis and the Memphis Mafia by Alana Nash. It's a striking contrast, the most famous man in the world, yet someone who carried a deep inherent feeling of incompleteness. Did the presence of Jesse's memory truly shape every major decision Elvis made, even subconsciously? Could his later struggles with addiction be traced back to an attempt to numb that very first, deepest wound of loss? What if Jesse had lived? Would Elvis's life and personality have been entirely different, perhaps even preventing the rise of the legend we know? Number 15, was he always searching for a father figure? Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was a complicated man. He loved Elvis, but his presence in Elvis's early life was often sporadic and troubled. Well, Vernon was, at various times, in and out of trouble, even spending time in prison for forging a check. This meant that Gladys was often the primary, if not sole, stable parent figure during Elvis's formative years. While Gladys provided immense emotional support, Vernon's unreliability left a void, a lack of consistent masculine guidance. As Elvis grew older and became famous, this void became apparent in his relationships with other men, especially those in positions of authority or influence. The most obvious and significant example is Colonel Tom Parker, his manager. Parker, a shrewd and manipulative figure, stepped into a paternal role, albeit a very self-serving one. He took charge of Elvis's career, finances, and pretty much his entire public life. Elvis, in turn, often referred to Parker as the Colonel and deferred to his judgment, even when it was clearly against his own best interests, as detailed extensively in Guralnick's biographies. This dynamic with Parker isn't just about management. It's about a deep psychological need. Elvis, who had never truly had a strong, consistent male authority figure, perhaps subconsciously sought one out. And Parker filled that role, becoming a surrogate father who guided and protected him, but also controlled and exploited him. The relationship was complex, almost symbiotic. Elvis depended on Parker, and Parker absolutely depended on Elvis for his wealth and status. Even when Elvis's friends and even Priscilla urged him to break free, he rarely could, citing loyalty and a sense of obligation. This speaks to a deeper psychological attachment, similar to a son's attachment to a father, even a flawed one. Beyond Parker, Elvis also gravitated towards strong male figures in the various spiritual and self-help gurus he encountered in later life. He sought guidance, wisdom, and a kind of mentorship that suggested an ongoing search for that missing paternal presence. His fascination with firearms and law enforcement and his friendships with policemen could also be seen as an attraction to figures representing order, authority, and protection qualities he might have missed in his own father during crucial developmental years. This search for a father figure manifested as a lifelong quest for external validation and guidance, particularly from older, more powerful men. If Vernon had been a more stable present father, would Elvis have ever fallen so completely under Colonel Parker's sway? Did his desperate search for male mentors ultimately lead him down paths that were not truly his own? How much of his inability to assert himself later in life stemmed from this early parental dynamic? Number 14, was his shyness a performance or a true part of him? Before the hip swivels and the snarling lip, Elvis Presley was described as a remarkably shy, polite, and reserved young man. Those who knew him in high school and in his early days at Sun Records often spoke of his quiet demeanor, his courtesy, and his almost demure nature. He was hesitant, sometimes even nervous, on stage when he first started performing. Early footage and anecdotes from his first shows attest to this. He was often awkward, unsure of how to move, just trying to sing the songs. But then something happened. When the music hit him, when the energy of the crowd met his own burgeoning charisma, a transformation would occur. The shy boy would disappear, replaced by the electric, boundary-pushing performer who would shake, rattle, and roll his way into history. This persona was so powerful, so captivating, that it's easy to forget the quiet kid underneath. This contrast presents a psychological puzzle. Was the shyness a genuine part of him? Or was it a mask he wore off stage, a respite from the intensity of his stage persona? Many close to him confirmed that off stage, especially in intimate settings, he remained a fundamentally private and somewhat introverted person, where he enjoyed reading, watching movies, and quiet conversations with his close circle. The flamboyance, the swagger, the king persona was largely confined to his public appearances and his carefully constructed image. This suggests a true bifurcation of his personality, the internal, sensitive Elvis, and the external, electrifying performer. This ability to compartmentalize and switch between these two modes is a fascinating aspect of his psychology. It allowed him to cope with the immense pressure of fame by creating a character that could withstand the glare, while his true self sought refuge. This wasn't an act in a cynical sense. It was a coping mechanism, a way to manage the demands of an unprecedented level of stardom. The stage became a release, a place where he could channel his energy and emotions without having to be the real Elvis. And the real Elvis, for all his fame, still craved a sense of normalcy and privacy. This tension between his private shyness and his public exhibitionism was a constant throughout his life, offering glimpses into a deeply complex and often misunderstood individual. Accounts from musicians who played with him in the early days, like Scotty Moore, often describe his quiet nature before the music started. Did the constant demand to be Elvis eventually erode the shy private part of him, leaving him adrift? Was his later reliance on drugs an attempt to either amplify the performer or quiet the private man who couldn't cope? Could his shyness also have contributed to his difficulty saying no to his manager and others, given his inherent desire to avoid confrontation? Number 13, how did the mama's boy navigate a world without his mother? The relationship between Elvis and his mother, Gladys, was legendary in its intensity. She was his world, his confidante, his biggest supporter, and in many ways the emotional center of his universe. Her accounts from Peter Guralnick's last Train to Memphis paint a vivid picture of this bond. When Elvis started to gain fame, his first instinct was to ensure his parents, especially Gladys, were comfortable. He bought them a pink Cadillac, a house, and provided for their every need. His love for her was unconditional and absolute. Friends described him as completely devoted, often calling her several times a day, even from the road. In Gladys's sudden death in August 1958, while Elvis was serving in the army in Germany, was the single most devastating event of his life. He was inconsolable, publicly weeping at her grave, struggling to come to terms with the loss. This wasn't just grief, it was as if a foundational pillar of his psychological existence had been removed. She was his anchor, his safe harbor. Without her, he seemed to lose a part of himself. This trauma marked a significant turning point in his life. Many close to him observed that he was never truly the same after her passing. Psychologically, this profound loss meant he lost his primary source of unconditional love and emotional security. He had relied on her heavily, and her absence left a gaping wound. This might have contributed to his later struggles with identity, his search for meaning, and his increasing reliance on external comforts and distractions. The immediate aftermath saw him turning to comfort food and the beginnings of his eventual struggles with prescription medication, seeking solace from the unbearable pain. His subsequent relationships with women, particularly Priscilla, have often been analyzed through the lens of this immense loss. He sought someone to fill the void, someone who could offer that same level of devotion and understanding. Priscilla's youth and pliability, her willingness to conform to his desires, might have unconsciously appealed to his need for a mother figure, or at least someone who could provide the kind of unwavering support he had lost. The mama's boy, cut adrift from his mama, spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild that lost sense of security, often through increasingly unhealthy means. Did Elvis ever truly process his mother's death? Or did he spend the rest of his life in a prolonged state of unacknowledged grief? How much did this deep trauma influence his choices in women, always seeking that unconditional maternal love? If Gladys had lived, would he have avoided the downward spiral of his later years, or was his path already set regardless? Number 12, why did the rebel of the 50s become the people pleaser of the 60s? In the mid-1950s, Elvis Presley was pure rebellion. His music, his movements, his look, it all challenged the established norms. He was seen as a threat to societal values, a symbol of youthful defiance. Parents were outraged, teenagers were enthralled. He was called Elvis the Pelvis by critics who found his gyrations vulgar. This image of the rebel was authentic. He pushed boundaries not just for shock value, but because it was simply how he expressed himself. He genuinely didn't fit into the polite, buttoned-down America of the Eisenhower era. This is well documented in countless newspaper articles and TV reports from the time, which often expressed moral panic. However, after his army service and upon returning to Hollywood for a string of mostly mediocre films, a different Elvis emerged. The raw edge seemed to soften. The rebellious spirit was largely suppressed. He became, by many accounts, much more agreeable, eager to please. The rock and roll fire was banked, replaced by a willingness to churn out movie after movie, often with forgettable songs that pleased the studios and, more importantly, Colonel Parker. He adopted a new, clean-cut image, wearing conservative suits, adhering to scripts, and generally playing it safe. Psychologically, this shift can be understood as a complex response to immense pressure and control. The army had been a formative experience, imposing structure and discipline. But it was also Colonel Parker's relentless pursuit of mainstream appeal and financial gain that drove this transformation. Parker believed that to maximize Elvis's earning potential, he needed to shed the controversial rebel image and become an all-American, family-friendly entertainer. And Elvis, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of a desire for continued success, perhaps from a deep-seated need for approval that existed beneath the rebel facade, went along with it. This shift from rebel to people-pleaser wasn't necessarily a betrayal of himself, but a psychological adaptation. The fame had brought with it immense scrutiny and criticism. To survive and thrive in that environment, some part of him decided it was safer to conform, to be liked by everyone, rather than to challenge. This meant sacrificing some of his artistic integrity and his rebellious spirit, leading to a decade where he was commercially successful but creatively stifled. The fear of losing what he had, of being rejected by a wider audience, might have been a powerful motivator. Did the rebellious Elvis truly disappear, or was he merely suppressed, waiting for the right moment to reemerge as he did in '68? Was his people-pleasing a conscious choice, or a subconscious surrender to the forces around him? What would have happened if he had fought harder to maintain his rebellious artistic vision in the '60s? Number 11. Why did the man who loved the spotlight also crave solitude? Elvis Presley was undoubtedly a showman. He loved the adulation, the roar of the crowd, the energy of a live performance. He thrived in the spotlight, and his charisma was undeniable. Interviews and concert footage clearly show a man who was made for the stage, someone who fed off the energy of his audience. He often spoke about the connection he felt with his fans, a bond that seemed essential to his artistic spirit. Yet, despite this magnetic public persona, Elvis also had a profound need for solitude and privacy. He would often retreat to Graceland, creating a kind of fortress around himself. While he was surrounded by his Memphis Mafia, there were long periods where he would mostly stay within his estate, going out only rarely, sometimes under cover of darkness. He would spend hours alone in his room, reading spiritual books, practicing karate, or simply watching TV. This isn't the behavior of someone who solely thrives on external validation. This deep craving for quiet, for a personal space away from the public gaze, suggests a different psychological need. This apparent contradiction can be understood as a coping mechanism for the overwhelming demands of global superstardom. The intensity of being Elvis Presley, of constantly being on, of having every move scrutinized, was immense. The spotlight, while exhilarating, was also draining. To maintain his sanity and recharge, he needed periods of absolute withdrawal. Graceland became his sanctuary, a place where he could momentarily shed the weight of being the king and simply be Elvis Aaron Presley. His interest in spiritualism, numerology, and various philosophies also points to an inner world that sought meaning and quiet contemplation. These weren't pursuits he engaged in publicly. They were private quests for understanding, undertaken in the quiet solitude of his own space. This introspective side, often overshadowed by his flamboyant public image, reveals a man who needed to process his experiences away from the noise and demands of fame. His need for privacy became more pronounced as his fame grew, a desperate attempt to carve out a personal life from the relentless demands of his public one. Was his craving for solitude a sign of deep introversion, constantly battling an extroverted career? Did his forced reclusiveness in later years actually exacerbate his loneliness, despite his initial need for quiet? What was he truly searching for in those hours alone at Graceland, and did he ever find it? Number 10, was his generosity a form of love or a way to buy affection? Elvis Presley was famously, almost notoriously generous. He would give away cars, jewelry, and cash to friends, family, and even strangers on a whim. There are countless stories of him seeing someone admire a piece of jewelry or hearing about a need and simply giving it to them. He often bought multiple Cadillacs in one go, handing them out like candy. This lavish generosity was a consistent trait throughout his life, from his early days when he bought his mother a pink Cadillac to his final years in Graceland. On the surface, this was an expression of his big heart and his desire to share his immense wealth. It was a way for him to show love and appreciation to those around him, especially his inner circle. the Memphis Mafia, who were essentially on his payroll. He clearly enjoyed seeing others happy, and he felt a deep responsibility to provide for his loved ones, stemming from his own impoverished beginnings. This genuine warmth and desire to help are well documented by his friends and family. However, from a psychological perspective, such extreme generosity can also be interpreted in more complex ways. For someone who was constantly adored by millions but also isolated by his fame, giving gifts could have been a way to solidify loyalties and ensure affection. It could have been a way to keep people close, to prevent them from leaving him. The friends who benefited from his largesse were often dependent on him, economically and socially. This dependency, while perhaps not consciously intended, created a powerful bond that was hard to break. And furthermore, his generosity could have been a way to exert control or to alleviate guilt. Perhaps he felt guilty about his vast wealth while others struggled, or perhaps he used gifts to smooth over difficult situations or to prevent confrontation. It might have been easier to buy a friend a car than to have a difficult conversation. And this isn't to say his generosity wasn't genuine, but it highlights the complex motivations that can underpin such behavior, especially for someone in his unique position. His generosity, therefore, was likely a mixture of genuine warmth, a desire to create a loyal entourage, and perhaps an unconscious attempt to buy the affection and presence he so desperately needed. Did Elvis ever truly know if people loved him for himself or for his ability to provide? Was his generosity a symptom of his deep-seated loneliness, an attempt to fill the void with people and their gratitude? How much did this extreme giving contribute to the unhealthy codependency within his inner circle? Number 9, what was behind his obsession with law enforcement and authority? Elvis Presley had a lifelong fascination with law enforcement. He collected badges, uniforms, and weapons. He had a custom police scanner in his car and would sometimes drive around Memphis, offering to assist police officers or even pulling over cars he thought were speeding, impersonating an officer. His most famous acquisition was a federal agent's badge from President Richard Nixon in 1970, which he deeply coveted. He felt a profound connection to the idea of law and order, of upholding justice. This obsession wasn't just a quirky hobby, it held significant psychological weight. One interpretation is that it stemmed from his early life experiences. His father, Vernon, had a history of brushes with the law, even serving time in prison. This created an environment where the law was perhaps seen as a force that could take loved ones away or as something to be feared. For Elvis, embracing the law, becoming an honorary officer could have been a way to reverse that dynamic, to gain control over a force that had once felt threatening. It was a way of aligning himself with power and authority rather than being subjected to it. Another perspective is that, as the ultimate rebel figure of the 1950s, Elvis later sought to legitimize himself in the eyes of society. Having been demonized by parents and authority figures for his music and image, becoming associated with law enforcement could have been a powerful way to demonstrate his respectability and patriotism. In his meeting with Nixon, where he expressed his concern about drug culture and the decline of traditional American values, suggests a desire to be seen as a serious, civic-minded individual, not just a rock and roll star. Furthermore, his role as the king put him in a position of immense power and influence, but also isolation. Identifying with law enforcement figures, who are often seen as protectors and upholders of justice, could have been a way to channel his own sense of responsibility and his desire to do good in the world beyond just entertaining. It allowed him to project an image of control and moral rectitude, perhaps contrasting with the chaos and excesses of his personal life. Did Elvis genuinely believe he could make a difference as an honorary law enforcement officer, or was it more about status and identity? Was his admiration for authority a way to compensate for his own perceived lack of control in other areas of his life, especially regarding his management? How much did this obsession with law and order clash with his own struggles with prescription drug abuse later in life? And number 8, was he a spiritual seeker or just searching for a quick fix? Elvis Presley was deeply interested in spirituality, philosophy, and religion throughout his life. He grew up in a Pentecostal church singing gospel music, which remained a lifelong passion. But his spiritual exploration extended far beyond traditional Christianity. He amassed a vast library of books on subjects ranging from numerology, meditation, the occult, Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, and various self-help and philosophical texts. He would often spend hours discussing these topics with his friends and even strangers, seeking answers to existential questions. This intense interest suggests a genuine yearning for deeper meaning and understanding beyond the superficiality of fame. As a man who had achieved ultimate material success, he often expressed a feeling of emptiness, a sense that something fundamental was still missing. His spiritual journey was a sincere attempt to fill that void, to find answers to questions about life, death, and his purpose. This is reflected in numerous accounts from his inner circle, collected in books like Elvis and the Memphis Mafia by Alana Nash and Priscilla Presley's memoir Elvis and Me. However, his approach to these spiritual pursuits was often eclectic and, at times, somewhat superficial. He would jump from one philosophy to another, sometimes picking and choosing elements that appealed to him without fully committing to a single path. He sought immediate insights, quick enlightenment, or answers that could offer solace or control over his troubled life. This could be interpreted as a psychological tendency to seek quick fixes, a pattern that also manifested in other areas of his life, notably his reliance on medications. He was a seeker, yes, but perhaps an impatient one, looking for immediate solutions to profound inner turmoil. His fascination with the paranormal and the mystical also suggests a desire for extraordinary experiences, a way to transcend the mundane reality that, despite all its glitter, often left him feeling unfulfilled. This blend of genuine spiritual hunger and an almost childlike impatience for answers characterizes a significant aspect of his psychological landscape, showcasing his complex relationship with faith and belief. Did Elvis ever truly find the spiritual peace he was searching for, or was it a perpetual, unfulfilled quest? How much did his inability to commit to one spiritual path contribute to his underlying restlessness? Could his spiritual seeking also have been a way to escape the harsh realities of his fame and personal struggles, rather than confronting them directly? Number 7. How did the object of millions of desires cope with his own romantic failures? Elvis Presley was perhaps the most desired man on the planet for decades. Women screamed, swooned, and fainted at the mere sight of him. He had countless opportunities for romantic encounters and relationships. Yet despite this overwhelming adoration and access, his personal romantic life was often turbulent, deeply unsatisfying, and ultimately marked by significant failures. His marriage to Priscilla ended in divorce, and his subsequent relationships were largely fleeting and rarely brought him lasting happiness. Psychologically, this disconnect between his public image as a romantic idol and his private struggles points to a profound difficulty in forming and maintaining healthy, intimate connections. One reason might be the impossible idealization he experienced. How do you form a normal relationship when everyone sees you as a god? Any woman he was with would inevitably be compared to the myth, not the man. This created an immense pressure on his partners and on himself. His upbringing also played a role. The intensely close, almost suffocating bond with his mother Gladys set an incredibly high bar for any future romantic partner. He sought a woman who could provide that same level of unconditional love, devotion, and nurturing. Priscilla, being young and willing to be molded, initially fit this role, but as she grew into her own person, the dynamic shifted, leading to conflict. This is extensively detailed in Priscilla's memoir, Elvis and Me, where she describes his desire for her to remain a certain way, almost frozen in time, to suit his needs. Furthermore, his fame and wealth often attracted people who were either starstruck or seeking personal gain. It was incredibly difficult for him to discern genuine affection from opportunistic infatuation. This bred paranoia and distrust, making true intimacy elusive. The constant presence of his Memphis Mafia also made true privacy almost impossible, further hindering the development of deep personal bonds. He was the object of millions' desires, but in his own life, he struggled to find and hold onto a love that could transcend the glitz and the myth. Did Elvis truly understand what a healthy, reciprocal, romantic relationship entailed, given his unique life experience? Was he subconsciously doomed to romantic failure, because no real woman could ever live up to the fantasy that surrounded him? Could his romantic struggles also have been a reflection of his own deep insecurity, despite all his outward confidence? Number 6 was his quest for control, a reaction to being controlled. From the moment Colonel Tom Parker took over his management in the mid-1950s, Elvis Presley's career and much of his life was meticulously controlled. Parker made all the major decisions: what movies to make, what songs to record, where to perform, and how much Elvis would get paid, often taking a significant cut for himself, sometimes 50% or more. As Elvis, while achieving unprecedented fame, often felt like a pawn in Parker's grand scheme. He made films he hated, recorded songs he didn't care for, and toured relentlessly, all under the Colonel's strict guidance. Biographers like Peter Geralnik consistently highlight Parker's iron grip on Elvis's career. Psychologically, this lifelong experience of being controlled by an external force had a profound impact. It fostered a deep-seated need for control in other areas of his life, areas where he could exert his will. This manifested in various ways his inner circle. The Memphis Mafia was completely beholden to him. He controlled their lives, their schedules, their finances. He dictated their behavior, and they rarely questioned him. This gave him a sense of absolute authority within his personal kingdom, a stark contrast to his professional subjugation. His environment, Graceland, became his personal fortress, where every detail was arranged to his liking. He controlled the temperature, the TV channels, the food, and the people allowed in and out. It was a space where he was king, undisputed. His appearance, he meticulously controlled his image, from his hair to his clothes, projecting a powerful, almost god-like persona. This was a visual manifestation of his desire for absolute command over how he was perceived. In his relationships, he often tried to control the women in his life, dictating their appearance, their behavior, and their presence. Priscilla, in particular, describes how he wanted to mold her into his ideal woman, a reflection of his own desires. This quest for control wasn't necessarily malicious. It was a psychological compensation for his lack of agency in his professional life. It was a way for him to feel powerful and effective, to push back against the constant feeling of being manipulated and directed. The more he was controlled by Parker, the more he sought to control everything and everyone within his immediate reach. Did Elvis ever truly understand the extent of Colonel Parker's control, or was he in denial about it? Could his attempts to control those around him have ultimately pushed away the very people he loved? What would have happened if he had truly broken free from Parker and taken control of his own career earlier in his life? Number 5. How did the shy singer become the most magnetic performer in history? When Elvis Presley first stepped on stage, he was often described as shy and nervous. He held the microphone with both hands, unsure of himself, but something transformative happened when the music started. An almost primal energy took over. His legs would twitch, his hips would move, and a sneer would appear on his lip. This raw, uninhibited performance style was unlike anything seen before, and it electrified audiences, particularly young women. He went from a shy, polite boy to an explosive, magnetic force of nature. This transformation isn't just about stage presence, it's a profound psychological shift. This magnetic quality wasn't manufactured. It was an authentic expression of something deep within him. It stemmed from his intense emotional connection to the music, particularly gospel and rhythm and blues. When he sang, he poured his entire being into it. He wasn't just performing, he was feeling every word, every note. This emotional honesty resonated deeply with audiences, creating an unparalleled connection. The shy boy simply couldn't contain the power of the music once it coursed through him. Psychologically, this stage persona offered a profound release. In his ordinary life, Elvis was often reserved and struggled with expressing his deeper emotions. The stage provided a safe space, a sanctioned outlet for him to unleash a more uninhibited, powerful version of himself. It was a place where he could be completely free without the social constraints or expectations of his private life. The adulation of the crowd fueled this transformation, providing positive reinforcement for his wild performances. He felt truly alive and validated on stage. His unique blend of vulnerability and raw sexuality created an irresistible allure. He wasn't just a singer, he was an experience. This magnetism was a core part of his identity as a performer, a conduit for emotions that he might have found difficult to express otherwise. The energy he put out was met and amplified by the audience, creating a feedback loop that made his performances truly legendary. This wasn't merely a conscious choice, it was a deeply ingrained aspect of his artistic and personal psychology. Did the sheer magnetism of his stage persona ever overwhelm the private man, making it hard to distinguish between the two? Could his reliance on this powerful stage presence have masked deeper insecurities he couldn't confront off stage? What would his life have been like if he had never found this outlet for his boundless, restless energy? Number 4. How did the man who was never alone end up? So lonely. Elvis Presley was rarely physically alone. From his earliest days of fame, he was surrounded by a constant entourage: family, friends, bodyguards, musicians, and employees. collectively known as the Memphis Mafia. At Graceland was a hub of activity, almost like a communal living space. On tour, he was always with his band and crew. He had personal assistants for almost every need. Someone to talk to, someone to share a laugh with, someone to watch a movie with, almost 24/7. Yet, despite this constant companionship, Elvis was often described as profoundly lonely, particularly in his later years. This paradox of being constantly surrounded yet deeply alone is a common psychological phenomenon among superstars. Fame creates a unique kind of isolation. Firstly, the sheer magnitude of his celebrity made it impossible for him to have truly normal interactions. People approached him with awe, fear, or a desire for something from him, rarely as just another human being. This created an emotional barrier. How do you form genuine connections when everyone sees you as the king and not just Elvis? Secondly, his inner circle, while providing companionship, also contributed to his isolation. Many were dependent on him financially and emotionally. This dynamic made it difficult for them to challenge him, to offer unbiased advice, or to truly be on an equal footing. He paid them to be there, and this dynamic, however loving, inherently created a power imbalance that hindered true intimacy. He lacked genuine peers, people who could understand his unique burdens without being compromised by his fame or his money. Finally, the incredible pressure of maintaining his image, of constantly being Elvis Presley, meant he rarely felt he could truly let down his guard. He couldn't share his deepest fears, doubts, or vulnerabilities with just anyone. The mask of superstardom, while essential for his career, also served as an impenetrable barrier to authentic connection. This emotional isolation, despite physical proximity, meant he carried an immense burden alone, leading to a deep, pervasive loneliness that no amount of company could fill. Did the presence of the Memphis Mafia ultimately protect Elvis or further isolate him from reality? Could his loneliness have been a direct consequence of his inability to trust genuine affection from those not on his payroll? What fundamental human need was left unfulfilled, even with millions of adoring fans and a constant entourage? Number 3 was his self-destruction, a slow suicide, or a cry for help. Elvis Presley's life ended tragically at the age of 42 on August 16, 1977, due to a cardiac arrest. However, the years leading up to his death were marked by a severe decline in his health, largely fueled by a heavy reliance on prescription drugs. He suffered from numerous ailments, including glaucoma, hypertension, an enlarged colon, and liver damage, all exacerbated by his drug use. This pattern of escalating drug abuse and neglect of his physical health has led many to question whether his self-destructive path was a slow form of suicide or a desperate cry for help. From a psychological standpoint, his drug dependency can be seen as a complex coping mechanism. He used prescription medications, barbiturates, amphetamines, opiates, to manage the overwhelming pressures of fame, to combat insomnia and anxiety, to maintain energy for his demanding touring schedule, and perhaps most profoundly, to numb emotional pain. The loss of his mother, the increasing disillusionment with his career, the breakdown of his marriage, and the deep loneliness he experienced all contributed to a profound sense of despair. The drugs provided a temporary escape, a way to switch off the relentless noise in his head. His pattern of addiction, however, wasn't a secret. Those around him, especially the Memphis Mafia, were well aware of his drug use, and some even enabled it, obtaining prescriptions for him. This suggests that his decline wasn't entirely hidden. There were cries for help, perhaps implicit in his deteriorating physical and mental state. His dramatic mood swings, his erratic behavior, and his increasing reclusiveness were all indicators of a man in deep distress. However, the powerful combination of addiction, his immense wealth, and the enabling environment around him made it nearly impossible for him to break free. The drugs offered him a false sense of control and comfort. He likely wasn't consciously seeking to end his life, but rather to escape the pain of living it. Yet, the persistent and escalating nature of his drug abuse, despite clear warnings from doctors and those who cared about him, suggests a deep-seated self-destructive tendency, a slow but steady surrender to the forces that were tearing him apart. It was a tragic end for a man who seemed to have everything, yet was tormented by internal demons. Did Elvis ever truly want to be saved from his addiction, or had he resigned himself to his fate? Were the people around him truly unable to intervene, or were they complicit in his self-destruction? If he had sought comprehensive psychological and medical help earlier, could his life have taken a drastically different turn? Number 2, what was the real identity crisis, Elvis Presley or the king? Elvis Presley. The name conjures an image, a legend, a phenomenon, but was it a person? This question lies at the heart of his profound identity crisis. From a young age, Elvis was a shy, humble boy from Tupelo. He loved his family, sang gospel music, and dreamed of something more. But almost overnight, he became Elvis the Pelvis, the king of rock and roll. He was transformed into a global icon, a myth, a symbol. This wasn't just a stage name, it became a separate entity, a public persona so powerful it threatened to consume the man underneath. Psychologically, living as the king created an immense burden. The expectations were astronomical. He had to be charismatic, energetic, alluring, and constantly on. There was little room for error, little room for vulnerability, little room for the real Elvis. This required him to essentially split his identity. There was the private Elvis Aaron Presley, the man who read books, watched TV, ate comfort food, and grappled with his personal demons. And then there was the king, the persona he donned for performances, public appearances, and even many social interactions. This constant performance, this internal struggle between man and myth, led to a deep sense of alienation and confusion. Who was he really? Was he the humble boy from Mississippi or the rhinestone-clad superstar? Was his value inherent or derived solely from his ability to be the king? This identity crisis was exacerbated by Colonel Parker, who relentlessly reinforced the king persona, rarely allowing Elvis to express himself authentically or pursue projects that deviated from the established image. The public expected the king, and Parker ensured they got him, even if it meant sacrificing the man. As he aged, the gap between the two identities widened. The demands of the king became heavier, requiring more physical and emotional energy, more drugs to maintain the illusion. The private Elvis became increasingly fragile, isolated, and disillusioned. This psychological split ultimately contributed to his personal downfall as the authentic self struggled to survive under the crushing weight of the legendary persona. He literally died trying to be the king, leaving the world to wonder what kind of man might have existed had he been allowed to simply be Elvis Presley. Did Elvis ever truly reconcile these two identities within himself, or was he forever fragmented? How much did the constant expectation to be the king prevent him from growing and evolving as a person? If he had lived a more normal life away from the spotlight, would he have found a stronger, more integrated sense of self? Number 1, what was the deepest wound Elvis carried throughout his life? Of all the psychological profiles we can construct for Elvis Presley, perhaps the most pervasive and defining element of his inner life was a profound, persistent sense of insecurity and a desperate need for love and validation. This might seem contradictory for a man who received more adoration than almost anyone in history. Millions screamed his name, worshipped him, and bought his records. Yet beneath the swagger and the superstar veneer lay a deeply vulnerable individual who constantly sought reassurance. This deepest wound stems from his earliest experiences. Born into poverty, with a twin brother who died at birth and a father who was often absent or unreliable, Elvis's formative years were marked by instability and a pervasive sense of scarcity, not just of money, but of consistent security. His mother Gladys provided an overwhelming, almost suffocating love, which, while essential for his survival, also created a deep dependency. He was her everything and she was his. This created a template where love was intense, sometimes possessive and central to his sense of worth. When he achieved fame, the adoration he received was exhilarating, but it was also conditional. It was for Elvis the Pelvis, the king, the performer. He constantly worried that it could all be taken away, that he would be exposed as a fraud, or that people would stop loving him. This deep insecurity fueled his relentless desire to please, to perform, to give, and to control. He lavished gifts on friends and family, perhaps as a way to ensure their loyalty and presence, preventing the feared abandonment. He surrounded himself with an entourage, never wanting to be truly alone with his doubts. His attempts to appear strong, rebellious, or even aggressive at times were often a cover for this underlying fragility. The spiritual seeking, the pursuit of control, the endless romantic entanglements, all can be traced back to this core wound. He was trying to fill a bottomless well of insecurity, searching for an ultimate source of unconditional love and validation that he felt he had lost with his mother's death, or perhaps never fully possessed in the first place due to the instability of his early life. This wound was the engine of his ambition, the source of his generosity, and ultimately the tragic vulnerability that led to his decline. He wanted to be loved, truly loved, not just for the king, but for Elvis Aaron Presley, The scared, insecure boy from Tupelo was Elvis's constant need for validation, an unfillable void, destined to be his undoing regardless of his fame. Could any amount of love or success have truly healed the deep-seated insecurities he carried from childhood? What if he had been able to confront and work through this core wound instead of trying to medicate it or buy his way out of it?